Hello, this is S.J. Thomason with Christian-apologist.com. Yesterday in my class, I asked them, I said, how many of you have read Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged? It was a classic book that was out around the 1950s, and it was in response to communism. And I was super surprised that out of the 60 students I asked, 0 indicated they'd ever even heard of the book. And I was pretty taken aback. So on that note, I went back to review a few of the video interviews that I've had lately with some famous people. And I recalled a video that I had with Nancy Pearcey, Dr. Nancy Pearcey out of Houston Baptist University. And she had a few words to say about socialism, which is quite related to communism. So let's tune in without further ado to see what she has to say. These are some wisdom nuggets. Yeah, I think that one of the reasons why we're starting to see people like Jordan Peterson become more famous is because he is taking a view that we haven't publicized very much. A lot of the people who tend to lean to the right have been sort of hiding out and not saying as much about what's going on in the system. And I think that's why in 2016, when he started talking about the idea that the Canadian government was going to pass this C-16 bill and basically force speech on using gender pronouns, certain gender pronouns for transgender people, he spoke out against that, he wrote against that, and suddenly he became an international phenomenon.
Right. I mean, that's how I found out about him. And I thought it was so important that he was standing up to that. I don't think young people who haven't lived through Nazism and communism do not realize that totalitarianism starts by coercing your words. If you can coerce people's words, you can coerce their minds. And it's not a matter of, I think it was George Orwell who wrote, it's not a matter of making them agree. The government's not trying to make you agree. The government's trying to humiliate you. By forcing you to say something you don't really agree with, it breaks your spirit.
Yeah. Putting pressure. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
It's just by putting pressure, and I think the more we stay out or show a passive, action in our schools or colleges or what have you, the more it'll creep in little by little, and the more they'll try to shun us for taking a stance for why the body is important, for why Christianity is true, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I'd like to add on to that too. And as far as what you just mentioned with respect to totalitarianism, and I think about the scariness of, I'm a capitalist. I've always been a capitalist, and I think capitalism works. I teach human resource management, and capitalism is the only one that well works with our human natural motivations and incentives. And so it tends, it does get to extremes when some people decide to be too greedy. Obviously, that's a flaw, but socialism and communism are disasters. And we see the disaster of socialism as played out down in Venezuela. And I think if our young people pay attention to what went on in Venezuela, I think a lot of them would be turned off by it. But I think some of them are looking to the European version of socialism, where people have universal health care and there's a lot of social safety nets. But I have seen, I think there's correlations with that, the social safety nets and socialism in Europe, and the idea that people now don't lean on the church as much. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why we're seeing fewer people going to church and a rise in atheism. So.
Right. And of course, to pay for a socialist government, you have to tax people so heavily that they don't have much left to give to the church, and the church doesn't have as many resources to help people. So it's a vicious cycle. Solzhenitsyn, who of course was in a Soviet prison camp for many years, said people tend to think, well, capitalists, they're greedy, they have too much control, they get too much power, let's go to socialism. He said, well, you don't realize in socialism, you just replace one group in power. If it's not the entrepreneurs, if it's not the businessmen, the corporations in power, it's politicians in power. And they acquire exactly the same negative traits as businessmen do when they have too much power. So he said, look, you're going to have some group in power. And don't think that with socialism, you're going to get rid of power and you're going to have this wonderful utopia. Immediately, you have another privileged class. But there was actually a name for it in the Soviet Union. They were called the nomenklatura, and that meant the upper ranges of the government. All the government officials, they became an elite class who had all kinds of privileges, that ordinary people didn't have. So yeah, I agree with you. It's not only that it's economically disastrous, but you don't get rid of power. You just exchange one group for another.
Yeah, and you know, that reminds me of something I just read today in the New York Times that's kind of similar to that. So in there, I just read that a lot of very wealthy people in France right now have decided that they're going to donate money to rebuild Notre Dame, because we just saw that horrible thing that happened with the fire at the Notre Dame Cathedral. And so the French government has been able to come to an agreement with these people that they're going to give in total $850 million towards the rebuilding of Notre Dame, these very wealthy businessmen. And so what's really interesting is in France, because they have this yellow jacket movement, and or is it yellow vest movement. So they have the yellow vest movement, and so a lot of those people are protesting and saying, well, wait a second, if the wealthy, why are they giving money to this cathedral when they could be giving the money back to us to cure our social ills? So anyway, the point here is, there's another point that Nancy made that I think is really important. It's the idea of where power is distributed under a socialist regime. And note that if power is distributed to the government, unlike businesses, the government actually has control and is able to be more manipulative. Businesses go in and out of business, and as you know, there's a very large death rate, a significant death rate for businesses going out of business if they don't succeed and if they aren't doing a good job. If they aren't serving society in some positive way, then they're going to fail. But governments don't necessarily fail right away. They could be going on and on and on. And we've witnessed that in some communist regimes in the last 50 years. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that you came in today. Please like and subscribe, and do come again. You can reach me at christian-apologist.com. Goodbye.